Research Network. This network is funded by HRSA with over 100 active researchers across 9 research nodes and a listserv membership of over 2,000 individuals and growing. We study how and when to intervene to improve children's long-term health trajectories. From a life course health development perspective, we acknowledge that families are a proximal, perhaps the most proximal influence on a child's development in those early years. And we believe that in order to improve children's health, we must also improve family health. We see this as an understudied area, and we're hosting this webinar series to bring together some various experts on families to help us think about how we can better support the health and well-being of families through our intervention research. Our focus today is on family resilience. What does it look like to build the resilience of families as systems rather than just individuals? Can family resilience impact family members' health and well-being throughout the life course? If so, how? And what are the limitations of viewing things from a resilience perspective? These and other things we'll be exploring today. And it's actually my pleasure to introduce our 2 wonderful speakers. First is Dr. Nastassia Hajal, who's an assistant clinical professor in the UCLA Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences, and assistant director of the Nathanson Family Resilience Center's Early Childhood Core. Dr. Hajal's research bridges basic science on developmental psychopathology, parenting, emotion, and neuroscience with clinical research on the promotion of family resilience in the face of stress. She has a particular interest in studying caregiver emotional processes and emotion regulation at the family level. Some of her current research projects include an NIH-funded RCT examining caregiver emotion regulation, brain-based biomarkers of emotion in response to a preventive intervention in parents who have their own histories of childhood interpersonal trauma, as well as studies examining parenting, emotion, socialization, and response to preventive interventions in Latinx families. Dr. Hajal is also a licensed clinical psychologist who supervises clinical psychology and child psychiatry trainees in the UCLA Family Stress, Trauma, and Resilience Clinic, which focuses on the prevention and treatment of traumatic stress in children, adolescents, and their families. She received her undergraduate degree in psychology from the University of Michigan and her master's and PhD from the Pennsylvania State University. And next we have Dr. Froma Walsh, who's an internationally respected clinical scholar and the Firestone Professor Emerita at the University of Chicago. She's also co-founder and co-director of the Chicago Center for Family Health. Dr. Walsh is the leading expert on family resilience with extensive experience in application with a range of adverse challenges involving trauma and loss, disruptive life events, and multi-stress conditions. Her research-informed family resilience framework is applied worldwide in research, clinical practice, and community-based services with at-risk youth and vulnerable families. Her collaborative systemic approach integrates developmental, relational, sociocultural, and spiritual perspectives. She's a valued consultant nationally and internationally for resilience-oriented training and practice. Dr. Walsh, a clinical psychologist, received her BA degree with honors in psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, a master's of social work degree at Smith College, and a PhD in human development and behavioral sciences at the University of Chicago. She is past president of the American Family Therapy Academy and past editor of the Journal of Marital and Family Therapy, and the recipient of many awards for distinguished contributions to the mental health field. She has over 120 scholarly publications and some notable recent books, including Strengthening Family Resilience, now in its 3rd edition, and currently in press, Complicated and Traumatic Loss, Fostering Healing and Resilience. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome our 2 excellent presenters. And just in terms of the format for the webinar today, each of our presenters are going to have an opportunity to showcase some content on this topic of family resilience, taking about 10 minutes each. And then I will join with them and kind of as a panel, explore these topics in more depth with each other, and then certainly turn to our audience for any questions. So if questions come up for you all, please feel free to insert those into the chat or otherwise document them. or raise them towards the end of our time together so that we can get into those questions. So I will now turn our time over to our excellent presenters, and I believe we will begin with Dr. Walsh.
It's a pleasure being here with you today, and I look forward to our conversation about family resilience. I've been working in this area for several decades now, as we tried to shift attention away from ways that families fail under stress to understand how they can succeed. And so my work has been largely applying and learning from the research in the field across human development, across the clinical field that looks at stress, coping, and adaptation. And I was really drawn to the area of resilience because particularly in the clinical field, there's a tendency to over-focus on problems and deficits, particularly in families and especially in mothers. And so my whole orientation has been to look at families under stress, but understand a little bit better what are those processes in relational transactions that can help us to overcome those obstacles and to succeed. So let me just show a few slides, very kind of a light look at some of these perspectives. Okay. First of all, to understand resilience, we have to deal with our larger cultural tendency to focus on the individual. In fact, over my career, I'm talking with colleagues, it's difficult to get funding for family research, and particularly if it's not problem focused. So we tend all the time, there's a default to go back to the individual, and it's not surprising that the resilience research began looking at individual traits for children who managed to overcome adverse conditions and family factors to go on and not just to survive, but to thrive. And that kind of goes along with a cultural tendency to think about the myth of the rugged individual. We're all supposed to be able to overcome challenges on our own. We're invulnerable, tough, self-reliant, and it kind of fits as well with the macho image that it's weak and shame-laden, particularly for men, but it can happen to anyone, to acknowledge need for help and be dependent. But what we learn from research as well as our larger context worldwide is that human vulnerability and suffering is normal in adverse conditions. And so whether it's intervention or whether we're doing research, it's helping the families to find ways to cope and adapt in ways that they come in feeling that they are defective or there's something wrong with them, or they've been diagnosed with problems because they're having trouble managing highly stressful and sometimes very abnormal conditions. Secondly, is that as I surveyed the research in the 80s and the 90s, we could see that even though the focus was on individuals, that the importance of relationships came through, and that resilience is nurtured in our relationships and our connections in communities and cultural and spiritual resources. Third, resilience science has moved from looking at personal traits or something that you're born with or you have inherently that enables you to cope and adapt, to really look at multi-systemic processes over time and to see these as recursive influences. So this larger systemic view fits very much with a family systems approach where I concentrate on the family at one level, understanding that this is always biopsychosocial. And last is that these aren't, while some families are more vulnerable than others, the research really shows clearly that we can build resilience, not just through childhood and early adulthood, but some of my work has been in later life, and seeing that that the neuroplasticity and the kinds of connections that we have that keep us vital also enable older adults to thrive in as they move through the life course. And that these, rather than thinking of them as fixed traits, if we think of them as interactional processes, that's kind of an abstract way, but if we think of those as beliefs or belief systems, practices, skills, and supportive connections, that's really what it is that enables people to overcome their life challenges. The other common misconception of resilience is just bounce back, because when human systems, whether it's families, couples, or individuals, face crisis and chronic multi-stress conditions, there's going to be suffering, struggle, and setbacks. And this idea that you bounce back, that you just go back to normal, we've seen through the pandemic that that's really a myth, because we need to adapt as conditions are changing or challenging, and to construct a new normal, which again is very elusive to us in our current time and space with the pandemic and other economic sequelae. And finally, I guess I would say that resilience, if I were going to say what it involves, it's about struggling well. I think there's one misconception of resilience. It's that you maintain high functioning through a crisis or through persistent challenges. And in my reading and my experience, that isn't just the way it works. That most often there's a dip down as people experience adversity, and it's coming back up, not only to their former level of functioning or recovery, but really a positive growth that takes place. But what's involved here then is a reorienting of hopes and dreams when things can't be simply returned to, and an integrating of the adverse experience and the resilient response into the chapters of life passage. Now, a family systems perspective in looking at stressful challenges and adversity, we see how they affect all family members, their relationships, and family functioning of the family unit. And that multiple stressors, particularly recurrent or a pileup of stressors over time, compound distress. On the other side of it, family response, the way families approach a crisis or challenge, the way they respond in the aftermath, can support resilience for children, for all members, for their bonds, and for the family unit. And finally, that we also need vital resources beyond the walls of the family. We need to be connected to social and community resources and larger cultural, spiritual resources. And I would add here, because we won't have time, is we don't think about family resilience or individual resilience as this is how we're going to have people get through very, very serious life challenges, but we have to be looking at larger system changes at the same time. And as a systems thinker, it's really a both and. It isn't, well, do we change systems or do we, work and shore up individuals and families? We have to be doing both. Maybe I have a couple more minutes. My work really then is showing how we can, through intervention programs that's grounded in and informed by research, build family capacities to overcome adversity. And what it involves is coping, adaptation, And what I think is most interesting in the concept of resilience, more than surviving, but regaining or gaining the ability to thrive. And that often people experience positive growth. And in the discussion, you may want to refer to that concept of positive growth that's in the individual literature. And so it involves working to strengthen bonds so that there is more support through tough times, becoming more resourceful through gaining skills, gaining practice in dealing with adversity, and regaining that ability to thrive. So over several decades, I developed a practice map to inform and guide our practice, community services, research, and social policy that mostly identifies and strengthens key family processes. And I'd like to highlight that we've come a long way in family systems where we're not seeing it family therapy as a modality, where if you are thinking about the family, we can be working with individuals, with couples, with sibling subgroups. We work in group settings. We work with community forums. And so that a family systems approach is really a conceptual orientation or framework that guides our work to be thinking about other influences, other potential resources as we're working with our clients. Okay. And partly it's looking for individuals in relational networks who can support, for instance, in a family that's quite vulnerable. It might be a single parent family lacking relational resources, and you have maybe an overstressed, under-resourced mother, most often, raising children and limited financial resources as well. What we want to do, even though we may not meet a larger family, is to assess who might be helpful with emotional support or practical support in the kin and social network, and to also look through past experiences of parents or of their family in inspiring their current efforts with their life challenges. So we listen for and we bring out stories of adversity and resilience. But fundamentally, when you think about family resilience, it's not simply the mother, even though she may be the primary or sole parent. We're looking at strengthening family functioning and who we can bring in to either the household or it may be across households to build a team effort. And I won't have time today to go into this, but in my framework, based on research over 3 decades, my own, but really the research literature as well, and from extensive clinical experience and frameworks in the family systems clinical field, as well as the stress and coping literature, identifying 9 key transactional processes or relational processes that come through in the various research and endeavors. And I've also constructed a questionnaire that's grounded in these 9 key that's used widely, more internationally actually, and has been translated into several languages. But I refer you to my publications if you're interested in understanding more what these processes are and how they can be built or strengthened in any kind of intervention. What I want to mention finally is that this comes from our center, Chicago Center for Family Health, over 30 years. We built a number of resilience-based programs that were in training for mental health and paraprofessionals, offering counseling services, and also community partnerships with agencies that were wanting to work with families that were in crisis. For instance, just as one example, when a factory closes down or relocates and 1,800 people lose their jobs. And there in Chicago, there was a service center to do retraining and help those individuals for reemployment. Often low income or lower skill, often immigrant individuals, often sole parents. But when they contacted us, they said, we see that this period is highly stressful in the family, which is also making it more difficult for that individual who has to go through a prolonged period of transition into new employment. And they wanted to work with the family. So we set up workshops that were convenient. We always try to assess with our partners what their resources are, how we can support them, what would be convenient, and how would they best show up and take advantage of these. So we use different formats. We worked in a diabetes center, again, with a larger community forums for families who had adolescents with diabetes. So we work with a range of things from crisis, trauma, and loss. My area is a complicated and traumatic loss and bereavement. And I've worked with that throughout my career. I've also done a lot of work with major disasters, working with the pandemic. There's a publication in the references I'll refer you to. Working in war and conflict related adversity and with challenges for refugees and resettlement. We had one program with disruptive family transitions around separation, divorce. Other colleagues, Celia Falikov, who is in San Diego actually, is the leading expert on working with immigrant families and transnational families. Multi-stress persistent conditions. Dr. Rowland, who is co-director of our center, works with illness and disability. He ran groups for called Resilient Partners, where one partner had multiple sclerosis and couples were challenged over time with different kinds of issues coming up, emerging. We've worked with families living in low income neighborhoods, particularly with racial, ethnic discrimination. And this approach is very good with at-risk youth and success. We set up family school partnership consultation groups that met monthly and became so successful that Loyola School of Social Work asked if they could incorporate it, and that's continued to this day at a much wider scale. And finally, we did a 2-year project with the LA Mayor's Office on gang prevention, positive youth development. And that's where we were training the counselors who often had maybe a bachelor's degree level, and they weren't trained in therapeutic techniques, but really helping them with a resilience orientation more broadly to bring in families as part of their multi-level approach to, with 1,000, they were working with 1,000 youth who had been identified at high risk for gang involvement in neighborhoods that were very high risk for gang involvement. And they did individual counseling, peer groups. We added the family component, and then they did community programs as well and mentoring. So that's where we see this as a potential for embedding in wider efforts, because sometimes programs that are community focused also involve the individuals, but they don't think about the family as really the missing link that can help to support both. I think I'm probably over my time, so I won't. I was going to mention the pandemic, but hey, aren't we beyond that? No, we aren't. Let me just mention my references here if anybody wants to take a screenshot quick before we go on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walsh. Very much appreciate your presentation. So I think now we'll make a transition to Dr. Hajal.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here today. Dr. Walsh, thank you for that presentation. It was so interesting to see. And let me share my screen. What I'll talk a little bit about today is mostly an example of a family level preventive intervention program that I have been working with for the last many years with colleagues here at UCLA. And but first I'm going to start just with a little bit of how I sort of came to be really interested in family level work and sort of how my interest in family level processes really came about. So when I was a graduate student in child clinical psychology at Penn State, when I was first kind of doing my initial clinical work, I was working with a lot of children with anxiety disorders or externalizing behavioral disorders. And I really was sort of struck by the fact that even though parents and caregivers are involved in many of our interventions for child psychological disorders, a lot of them don't really consider the parents' experience, internal experiences during the sort of parent-child interaction. So oftentimes we'll, tell parents that it's very important to not accommodate their children's anxious behaviors, or that they need to ignore their children's irritating behaviors, or if they need to set a consequence or do a timeout, they have to be very neutral when they do it. And that really, I think the missing piece is that parents have emotional responses to these situations with their children. I think especially to these situations with their children, right? If they're seeking out support for their children because they're having a lot of temper tantrums that are hard to manage, the family's probably gotten to the point where this is pretty emotionally evocative for the parents. So I was really interested in thinking about parent emotion and emotion regulation. So parents sort of process of what they're experiencing during parent-child interactions, but also how they are monitoring, evaluating, and modulating their emotional reactions. So we know from the research literature that caring for children is emotionally evocative, and that emotions and their regulation organize parenting behavior. I have bunch of citations. We know this from a multi-method research, parental self-report, observations of parent-child interactions, psychophysiology of measurements of parents. I could talk all day about this, but I won't go into it because I only have a few minutes here. But it was really sort of thinking about these processes, right? If we want to really help support a child's development, we really need to support all members of the family system, and that all members of the family system are having their own internal experiences sort of happening simultaneously. And so in thinking about parental emotion, and this is just one example, right? When we're thinking about, as Dr. Walsh was saying, like family systems look many different ways. But if we're just taking this example, we have these sort of in the moment stressors or cues that might be having an impact on parental emotion. So if a child has some negative affect, reduced social reciprocity, specific challenging behaviors that's triggering to the parent, and then that's all happening in the context of overarching stressors that the family might be encountering, right? Whether there are other caregiving supports, whether the family has the financial resources to meet their basic needs, whether the parent or caregiver has their own history of trauma or other adversity that may be impacting how they are able to engage with their child. So there are so many things, and this is just thinking about one parent and one child, right? When we kind of scope out to the entire family system, it gets much more complicated. So I became really interested in the idea of sort of taking a family-centered approach. And that was one reason I felt so lucky to be able to come do my training with the UCLA Nathanson Family Resilience Center, where they were really doing a lot of work in this area. So in terms of, just why would we take a family-centered approach? The well-being of a person and their families are inextricably linked. And I, just gave this example of a parent and a young child, but this also has to do, with couples or with siblings, any sort of combination of family members. We know that family members can play a significant role in enhancing or impeding another family member's recovery. Again, the example I just gave was, a parent having an impact on a child's course of treatment, but this can happen within any combination or combinations in a family system. That there's actually literature that shows that some families actually show a preference for family level services over individual services. And so they could really be an opportune point of entry for prevention and intervention efforts. For some, adults who are caregivers, they are more likely to engage in services, despite stigma or despite, financial burden or scheduling burdens, if they feel like it will do something for their family. So for these reasons, we take this approach. So what I'll be talking about today is an intervention called the FOCUS intervention is the acronym. It stands for Families Overcoming Under Stress. I'll tell you a little bit about the development and the research and evaluation support that exists for it. But as you can see here, I just took some screenshots of a few different program manuals that we have here. It was kind of initially developed for parents and caregivers of school-aged and adolescent children. We now have a version for parents and caregivers of preschool and kindergarten age children. There's a model for couples, and then this is our little feelings book for young children who participate. So I would say the sort of key things that I would say to describe FOCUS are that it's family-centered, it is trauma or resilience informed, and it's strengths-based. So this is like really sort of, I think, it's a hugely important piece where we're not just focusing on what's problematic in the family structure, what are the risk factors. We're really looking at, like, what does the family do really well? What are their resources? How have they actually shown strain in already getting through some of the adversity that they may have encountered? So we have real focus on this. And it's a skill building program. So it's very active, lots of different activities that are used to kind of introduce and practice skills. And so here are our 5 focus skills. I'll go into them a little bit in a minute, but I just wanted to say, these skills, the reason that these particular skills were chosen by the developers of FOCUS is really from the literature on resilience, right? So really what Dr. Walsh was just presenting. Some of these key elements that we know are mechanisms of resilience in families. So family members being able to, in a developmentally appropriate way, of course, understand the nature and cause of the stressor and how it has an impact on development and family interaction, open and emotionally resonant communication, the supportive and responsive parenting, so a strong caregiver-child relationship, and also a strong co-parenting or co-caregiver relationship, or if there are multiple caregivers, a flexible family structure. So this sort of being able to both maintain continuity in the face of adversity, but also the capacity to accommodate change. And then finally, the ability to make sense of an experience and endow it with meaning, and to really be able to do this as a family. So there's a review that I've cited down here by Saltzman and colleagues from 2011 that it sort of reviews some of this literature, and as well as sort of talking about how this theoretical work has been sort of infused into the development of the FOCUS program. So these are the focus skills that, from the literature, the program focuses on. Focus and focus. So the first is managing feelings or emotion regulation. So of course, coming from my graduate school work at Penn State, I was very excited to be working with a team that really had this emphasis on emotion regulation at the level of the family, as well as communication, goal setting, problem solving, and coping with reminders. So this would be trauma reminders or stress reminders or loss reminders. The development of focus and sort of foundational research, it was developed from a collaboration of teams at UCLA and Harvard Children's Hospital or Boston Children's Hospital. And so it sort of, it was developed kind of people who had worked with 3 well-established family-level preventive interventions. So these were all family-centered interventions that worked with families that had some specific type of adversity. So one was for families where there was a parent who had depression. One was for families with medically ill parents and their children. And one was for families that had experienced war and community violence. And so the intention here was to sort of like figure out what are the core elements, like the core active ingredients of these interventions, all of which had, you know, research support. And can we create a program that will sort of be not necessarily specific to one type of adversity, right? But that could be used for a variety of different types of family adversities. So I'll go into what it actually looks like in just a minute. But I'll say that so far, you know, the research and evaluation support shows overall support for long-term positive impact of focus on parental symptoms of depression, anxiety, and PTSD, child mental health symptoms, and other aspects of social emotional functioning, including pro-social functioning. I think we talk a lot about strengths in kind of implementing the focus intervention. So I think it's also important that when we talk about our outcomes, we're thinking about what are some of that we're not only talking about a reduction in symptoms, but we're also talking about increases or maintenance in sort of developmentally appropriate or positive behaviors. Family functioning, parenting behavior, child engagement with parent. We have some parent-reported data on this, as well as some observational data on this. And some of this work has been, some of this research comes from large-scale evaluation of focus, actually across military-connected families. It's been implemented at many U.S. military sites, as well as in a randomized control trial that was done. Data were collected starting in 2014 of civilian dwelling military families. And then we also have some ongoing projects that we'll talk about in a minute. But we've also found so far, we have some preliminary data suggesting that we don't see differences in intervention effects when looking at outcomes for families who identify as Hispanic or Latinx. That was about 40% of our RCT sample. And actually, the one place where we did see a difference, we actually saw more positive outcomes for Latina mothers. So that's sort of an exciting area of research that we're continuing to work on. But let me talk a little bit about what it is. So I mentioned that as part of the development of focus, the kind of intervention, the leads of these other family-centered interventions sort of came together and tried to sort of identify what are the core elements of how these interventions are delivering these skills, these family resilience skills, and how can we kind of infuse that into the focus program. And so there were 4. So one is family assessment and monitoring. So family's ability to sort of self-assess, to talk with a provider about, you know, how they're doing, and also just to self-assess and monitor their progress over time. To have appropriate psychoeducation and developmental guidance and just knowledge, right? This gets back at the idea of having an understanding of the nature and cause of a stressor and its impact. Skill building activities. So the 5 skills that I showed you on a previous slide, and then building a family narrative. So since I only have a few minutes today, I want to give you talk about the narrative and give you some examples of that, because one thing that I think when we're thinking about life course interventions, or something that can be applied at different points in the life course or at different points in a family's development. One thing I want to sort of point out with the focus program is that, you know, as I said, there's versions for families with older kids, there's versions for families with young children, there are versions for couples. And although the sort of delivery of some of these, the skills, the resilient skills differs, it all comes with these same core elements. So the narrative, I'll just give you a brief overview of the narrative. So the basic idea for the narrative is that it sort of documents significant family, either time periods or significant family events. And so that goes along the bottom, as you can see. And then up and down the side, we have our feelings thermometer that, you know, represents different types of, you know, comfortable emotions in the green zone, all the way up into very uncomfortable emotions in the red zone. So each family member maps their emotional experience during that specific family event. And I'll also say, like, you know, these aren't all negative events or red zone events. We actually try really hard, focus providers, to have some green zone events on timelines, right? Because we are strengths-based and we want to look at the positive things that the family has done and the things that they're proud of, as well as the challenging times. So you can see there's two different lines here. And in this family, this example family is a two caregiver family. One line represents Joe, one line represents Catherine, and this would be the parent timeline. So I'll show you some variations about what that looks like across different developmental stages. But first, I sort of also want to kind of show you how it's actually implemented. So what you just saw was the caregiver timeline. And so typically in the focus intervention, we have some sessions with just parents or caregivers, some with just children, and then some for the whole family. So typically we have caregivers, you know, complete their own narrative timeline just with them. And then the children will complete their own narrative timeline or time map. I'll show you a couple examples in a minute, just in a child only session. And then we'll do sort of a parent preparation session. And what that parent preparation session is to sort of help guide parents in what will be the upcoming whole family session, where everybody will share their timelines. And really the idea is to provide an opportunity for, you know, practicing emotional awareness, being able to communicate emotions, to see other people's perspectives, and to share information. And we find that this can be really helpful because during stressful times, there often can be miscommunications, or people, you know, may not caregivers might not really fully realize what their children are understanding or thinking. So there can be lapses in communication that can really have a lingering impact. So the idea is that this is a time for families to kind of correct some of those misunderstandings, and really importantly, to develop a shared meaning and what this means for their family and how they can grow and strengthen from it. But we do that, you know, incrementally over time with each kind of set of family members building their narratives and then eventually sharing. So here's just the caregiver one again. Here's an example of a child. This was a teenager, I believe in early adolescence, that created their timeline. So it's more, you know, there's a combination of the sort of more adult-like line graph type formats, but then there's also some drawings on there. You can tell that it was the teen who did the writing. There's a little bit of collaging where they maybe couldn't draw a Statue of Liberty or didn't want to. So you can see the sort of they put their own take on the activity. And then here's one, a time map for this was a 5-year-old child. So generally for kids who are younger, we'll work with them on more of a, almost, we always call it like, it's almost like a Candyland type board. It's a little bit more artistic. It doesn't have the feelings thermometer and sort of the line graph type set up in the same way, because younger children might have a harder time understanding that, or like this sort of sequential nature of the events might not be as important. But you can see we still have the sort of feeling thermometers. The different events here are encircled and written in different, in the sort of color zones of the feeling thermometer. So like this one, the new house, for example, is in a green box, and it says new house with a green marker. Dad leaving was in the orange zone. And then I know I don't have much time, so I'll just say really quickly, for caregivers and their young children, we actually do things a little differently. So this would be for 3 to 5-year-old children. We don't have kids make their own time map, but what we do is we have parents reflect on their child's experience, right? Because we really are thinking about, if the point here is to build emotion regulation skills and communication skills, right? If those are the family resilience skills, how do we build that in a 3-year-old child or a 4-year-old child? And so one of the ways that we think about perspective taking, right, is reflective functioning for parents of young children. So we have parents reflect on their child's experience to complete a timeline for their child. There's an actual one. It gets a little messy when we have a third person on there. We also talk with parents about strategies to enhance their relationships with their children. So strategies for child-directed play, emotion socialization, and emotion labeling, right, are ways of building skills and these skills in young children. And this is from an ongoing study that I'm working on now, where we're actually thinking about parents and caregivers' childhood experiences of trauma that might be sort of having an intergenerational impact on their relationships with their children. So we integrate, as you can see, kind of right next to the feelings thermometer, we integrate important experiences from the caregiver's own childhood that impact them as a parent. And so yeah, so ongoing. So these are just some ongoing things that we're doing. That study that I just talked about, we're also developing and piloting a Spanish language version of the intervention. And I will just acknowledge the funding and my collaborators, and I will stop there because I know I went over already.
No, thanks so much, Dr. Hajal. Really fascinating content from both presenters here. And I certainly want the remaining time we have here to be open to several things. So one is, for all of you in the audience, please feel free to jump into a discussion with us. That can be done through chat. Feel free to just pop in and voice a question you have or a comment. I also want to provide space for the presenters to react to each other's content if that feels right. And then I certainly have some notes here where I've been tracking some things. So maybe I'll get the ball rolling, because I think combined, these presentations have made a very compelling case for a focus on family systems. As we think about an optimal vehicle for promoting the health and well-being of a person, is thinking about this family, essentially this social convoy that traverses the life course together, which can shift and it can transcend a single household, and it can transcend shared biology, these social convoys we call families, and how we can shore up those families to optimize the health and well-being of individual family members. And there was a comment, Dr. Walsh, I think you made about how in some cases there are challenges around getting or securing funding for research, for intervention research that's focused on the family, especially focused on promoting positive outcomes, right? It's the National Institutes of Health, yet sometimes we like to see that focus on illness or pathology. Yeah, so how do we overcome that? Or what have been your experiences grappling with that? And how can we package our materials or make a case for a move in this focus on family and developing interventions, life course interventions that leverage the family to promote outcomes? What thoughts do y'all have on that?
I could just say one thing there. I think the very concept of resilience is strengths in dealing with adversity. So I know there are many research projects going on internationally that are working with a particular type of adversity. And you can usually get funding for the adversity. So it's like with parent loss or with effects of an earthquake. And so there may be funding available that isn't simply reducing risk. And sometimes you have to go at how can we reduce the risk for long-term traumatic effects, and how can we promote and foster a more healthy, positive life course in the aftermath. So I think if we can focus on different types of adversity, usually the research projects are then focused there.
That's very helpful. Other thoughts on this, Dr. Hajal, or anyone else in attendance here?
This is Neil Halpin. I have one question I want to ask, especially Dr. Walsh. And that is, when you think about family resilience, can you talk a little bit about what the developmental pathways are? You know, how do you think about these transactions that take place in terms of building resilience developmentally over time? Because one of the concepts we're trying to develop is this notion of family development. How do families develop? We measure in kids their ages and stages, but we don't necessarily have a good construct for family development and with a way that helps families create a narrative around their own development and what needs to happen. Can you reflect upon that a little bit from your work?
Yeah, and actually I was interested in the overlap of our two presentations. And I know Dr. Saltzman, and I know the work of Lester and colleagues. So when you said focus, I wondered, oh, is that related to the focus project that I know? So I'm delighted to see that it continues to expand and I know in my meetings with Bill Saltzman, he said that, you know, a lot of it just coalesced with the same processes that I identified. And when you talked about them too, we may use different words for them, or we may cluster them differently. But for instance, you just asked, and one of it is meaning making. The belief systems that families hold that have to respond to and adapt to and be changed by the conditions as they're changing over time. And I think that's where the life course perspective is so important. And it's missing in so much research, because you may get funding for an immediate response, whether it's an earthquake or a death of a parent or a crisis event. And it's very difficult to get funding to follow families over time. Dr. Rowland's work on chronic illness and disability is very good in talking about how family challenges are going to be changing, ebbing and flowing over time, so that the strengths that a family needs at the beginning in a crisis phase, and this would be true in any crisis, that you have to rally, pull together, and be very tightly knit and put other things to the side. But those strengths could become more dysfunctional over time when people have to attend to other matters and other affairs. So what we really need to do is have good research that tracks families as they adapt over time to changing conditions. So it is, and oftentimes we see graphs about individual resilience, and it's like something happens, and then how do they respond? They go down, they go across, they go down a little and come up again. But that in real life, I think your point is more likely there are going to be changes required over time, as maybe, let's say with an illness, that there's a remission and you go back to more of a normal or then there's a recurrence, or there is other family matters that come into play, or other members' needs that shoot up that weren't part of the original. And I think, to me, that's part of the complexity of family life that also many researchers they tiptoe away and they say, well, there's just too much going on in the family. And to me, that's life, and part of it is the messiness of it. But if we can do what you're suggesting and have better, and I think that's where I think we need more qualitative interviews that are longitudinal over time. Emmy Werner she's one of my heroes. You may know of her work in social sciences, and one of the first people looking at resilience in children, and then tracking them first in adolescence, then in young adulthood, then in middle life, or at least coming back to them. And I hope to see more longitudinal research.
Todd, I just had a quick question for Nastassia, and I love both the presentations. I think they've been really informative. I just wondered, in an intervention like Focus, is it easy to engage all the family members? Because I could imagine it's a fairly, emotionally demanding process. Is it a little easier to engage the mums, a bit more challenging to engage the fathers? Or could you give me a picture about engaging all the family, teenagers, for example?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And, I think it really depends. It depends on the family, of course, as it always does. But, I think with Focus, the idea is to work at the level of the family, right? And really, I think the emphasis that we try to make is that each individual family member has, a major impact on the functioning of the family as a whole. So I think it also probably depends on treatment or intervention setting, right? If you have families presenting for a preventive intervention versus coming into a clinic because maybe they have a lot, already going on, or are already experiencing some pretty significant symptoms. There's variation, but we've engaged multiple caregiver families, right? With both moms and dads. We have some, I know, with our current study, we have some dads who have participated, right? Where it's just the dad participating and not the mom. We've also worked with families where there is another, a relative caregiver. So not necessarily a mom and a dad, but maybe one parent and one grandparent, or other family member. I think in general, we have a lot of sort of a focus on activities and practice of skills and home activities. So what we'll often do is, if there's only one caregiver that's able to attend, because sometimes it's really just about scheduling demands, we'll try to work with, one caregiver to be able to share the information. We'll try to work with family schedules. In terms of engaging kids and teens, I think generally, because it's a fairly short-term intervention, I think that children or teens who might be more likely to disengage can sort of see the benefit of, engaging for a few sessions to be able to better communicate with their parents, or talk about their needs in a way that their parents might hear, right? That's really kind of how the provider is helping to support them. So, yeah, it varies, of course, but I think kind of the nature of the intervention sort of helps us be able to engage all family members, even if there's some hesitation or difficulty.
Excellent. Well, thank you all again so much. I'm cognizant of the time, so just another warm expression of gratitude for all of you who were able to join us for this webinar. Very grateful for our two excellent presenters. So grateful that both of you were willing to share your time with us this afternoon and share with us the details of your work. And so I believe this recording will be made available soon on YouTube. And so it's something that folks should feel free to revisit later on in the future. And I hope folks are able to join us for our next webinar, which is actually kind of sneaking up on us. I believe it's going to be next week on Friday, November 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And that's going to be focused on the topic of parents as drivers of systems change. And so we hope to see you all then. Thank you again. We hope you have a great rest of the day.